The cowboy waited for a mail-order bride, but identical twins stepped off the wagon. The dust lifted in swirls across the barren land, a golden haze that shimmered in the sun's descent as the cowboy stood by the old post road, his broad frame steady, his weathered hat casting shadow across eyes that had grown tired of waiting. For months he had carved the days into silence, his only company the restless winds and the creak of the wooden porch. Letters, faint with ink and heavy with promise, had tethered him to the hope of a bride sent by fate and distance. She was supposed to be the answer to his solitude, the warmth his ranch had never known. He had prepared his home for her, sanded the walls, built a table with his own hands, polished the silver his mother had left him. Every gesture was a vow to the woman whose face he had never seen, whose name had echoed in his heart more times than his own. When the wagon crested the hill, drawn by weary horses, his pulse pressed against his ribs like a fist pounding a locked door. The creak of wheels grew louder, dust rising until it blurred the horizon. He squared his shoulders, steady but unprepared for what destiny had woven behind those weathered planks. The driver cracked his whip once, and the wagon rolled to a halt in front of him. Then came the sound of skirts brushing wood, the delicate rhythm of footsteps that carried a future he had painted only in imagination. Yet when the curtain of the wagon lifted, his breath fractured. Not one woman stepped down, but two. Identical faces, identical eyes that mirrored each other like reflections in a still pond. Two women, bound by blood and mystery, each carrying the same silent power, the same untamed grace. The air itself seemed to split into two currents. He could not move, his eyes darting from one to the other as if searching for an answer written on their faces. One wore a smile, soft and full of curiosity, her gaze slipping over his figure as though testing the man fate had chosen. The other held her head higher, her expression guarded, her eyes sharp with something unspoken, as though she knew secrets not meant for him. They stood side by side, identical in every strand of hair, every curve of cheek, yet their presence was not the same. He felt it deep in his chest, the tug of choice, the silent battle between warmth and storm. He took a step forward, his boots sinking into the dust, his voice caught between disbelief and the weight of duty. There was to be one, he said, his tone low, almost swallowed by the prairie wind. The twins exchanged a glance, a language older than words, a bond forged from years of shared shadows. The smiling one spoke first, her voice lilting, steady as spring rain. There was one, she said, but where she goes, I go. The other twin's lips curved with the faintest shadow of irony. Or perhaps, she whispered, where I go, she follows. The cowboy's world tilted. The path he had etched for himself suddenly split into two trails that vanished into unknown hills. He searched their faces, trying to catch a glimpse of the woman from the letters, but both looked capable of holding secrets, both capable of carrying the soul of the one he had dreamed of. The memory of the letters blurred in his mind, lines written in a careful hand, promises of loyalty, of devotion, of building a life. Yet as he gazed at them, he could no longer separate which words belonged to which heart. Had one written and the other whispered the words beside her? Had both dipped pen into ink, weaving their voices into the letters that kept him alive through lonely nights? His silence stretched long, but the twins did not falter. The smiling one lifted her hand, extending it as though reaching for his trust. We came because the letter spoke. Of love, she said, her tone soft, trembling with sincerity. The other crossed her arms, her eyes holding his without yielding. We came because the world outside this land is cruel, and only together have we survived. If one of us belongs to you, then both of us must stand before you. Her words cut sharper than steel, but beneath the hardness he sensed a wound not easily healed. The cowboy's chest tightened. This was not the choice he had prepared for, not the path he had sharpened himself to walk. He had dreamed of one woman, one hand in his, one future steady and unbroken. Yet the horizon stretched before him now in doubled light, and he knew he could not separate one shadow from the other without tearing apart something sacred. The ranch around him seemed to listen, the fence posts leaning like silent witnesses, the horses shifting in the barn as if they too waited for his decision. Even the wind paused, caught between silence and song. Night fell slowly, smearing the sky in strokes of crimson and violet, as if the heavens themselves painted his uncertainty. He led them into the house, the walls glowing faintly in lamplight, the table he had built now holding the weight of more than he had ever imagined. The twins moved through the rooms, their laughter soft yet echoing, their presence filling the emptiness with layers of life he had never felt before. At times he caught himself forgetting they were two, for their steps blended, their gestures mirrored, their voices carried the same haunting rhythm. But when they looked at him, one with eyes of gentle fire and the other with eyes of guarded storm, he felt the ache of being torn in two directions at once. As days passed, the ranch transformed into a place of both harmony and tension. At dawn, one twin would ride with him, her laughter breaking the silence of the fields, her touch brushing his arm like a promise too sweet to name. At dusk, the other would linger by the fire, speaking little but watching him with a gaze that burned through the mask of her silence. He began to understand them not as halves of one soul but as two forces bound together, light and shadow, warmth and steel, devotion and defiance. And he knew, with each passing hour, that to choose one meant to wound the other, and perhaps himself. The cowboy, once certain of his solitude, now stood at the edge of a deeper wilderness than the land could ever hold. His heart, once a fortress, had become a battlefield where twin flames burned, neither yielding, both eternal. And as the days turned into weeks, he realized the truth, that the letters had never promised him ease, never promised him a path without thorns. They had only promised him love. But love had arrived not as he had dreamed it, but as a riddle written by fate, a riddle with no answer that left him restless beneath the endless sky. The nights grew longer as the prairie winds shifted, carrying with them whispers of autumn. The cowboy felt the weight of every breath he took within the walls of his ranch, walls that had once been hollow, filled only with silence and the echo of his own boots across the floorboards. Now those same walls carried two voices, two sets of footsteps, two lives that had stepped into his world like storm and sunlight. Each morning, when the horizon cracked open with pale light, he found himself torn in ways he had never thought possible. The twin who smiled, whose laughter seemed to smooth every rough edge of the land, carried with her a tenderness that made him feel young again, a reminder of what it meant to be alive. She would rise before the rooster's call, brush her hair with quick strokes, and step into the barn with bare determination. She was unafraid of work, hauling water, feeding the animals, pressing her hands into soil. As though she had always belonged to it, her joy was infectious, spilling into the air until even the horses seemed calmer in her presence. The other twin, quiet yet fierce, stood apart from such brightness. She watched the ranch like a sentinel, her eyes always scanning, her steps slower but steady, each movement deliberate. At times she seemed burdened by shadows unseen, yet the cowboy noticed she never faltered when hard work called. She fixed fences, hauled wood, sharpened tools with a silent rhythm that never broke. Her words were few, but when she spoke, they carried a gravity that sank deep into his bones. In the beginning, the cowboy thought he might find a sign, some gesture, some glance, that would reveal the bride meant for him. He read through the letters again and again, searching for a curve in the script, a phrase repeated, something that could tie one twin to the ink that had traveled across miles to reach him. But the words blurred. He began to wonder if both hands had written, if both voices had filled those pages, weaving their hearts together until he could no longer untangle them. The days carried him into the fields, where the soil broke beneath the plow, the sweat on his back mixing with dust as the sun pressed its weight upon him. And always, one of them would be there, sometimes the twin with laughter who steadied the horses and urged him to take a drink, sometimes the twin with fire in her eyes who said nothing, but held the plow steady when his hands faltered. At night, the house became a stage of silence and unspoken questions. He would sit at the table, their faces glowing in the lamp's soft light, his heart thundering against the cage of his chest, uncertain which gaze to return, which hand to reach for. It was not desire alone that troubled him. Desire could be tamed. It was the deeper pull, the sense that each twin carried a piece of something he could not live without. With the one, he felt the warmth of a hearth, a future where laughter would ring through the halls. With the other, he felt the fire of survival, the strength that would hold him upright when storms came crashing down. And so he walked between them, torn, restless, consumed by a question with no answer. The land, too, seemed to press its weight upon him, as though testing his resolve. Rains came late that year, leaving the soil cracked, the cattle restless, the wells thirsty. He rose earlier and worked later, his body carrying burdens that even his will strained to bear. Yet he was never alone. Each day, one twin rode beside him, their voices weaving into his silence, their presence filling what had once been emptiness. Sometimes he thought fate had not given him a choice but had instead given him both, two forces to bind his life, two souls to shape his destiny. But the nights betrayed him. He would lie awake on his cot, staring at the ceiling beams, hearing their laughter blend and echo, their whispers drifting like ghosts through the thin walls. He could not tell one from the other in the dark. He could only feel his own chest tighten, his heart beating like a drum against the silence. He dreamed of them, sometimes one, sometimes the other, sometimes both standing before him, their faces identical, their voices merging into one. And always, he woke with the taste of longing burning in his throat. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the sky turned to fire, he stood by the corral, watching the horses shift restlessly. The smiling twin joined him, her hair catching the last light, her eyes bright with unspoken hope. She leaned close, her voice low. "You've been carrying more than the land, haven't you?" she asked. His breath caught, but he said nothing. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his calloused skin. "You don't have to carry it alone," she whispered. And in that moment, he felt the pull of her warmth like a tide drawing him into shore. But before he could answer, before his hand could close around hers, the other twin appeared from the shadows of the barn. Her gaze cut sharp, her voice steady. "Careful," she said, her words quiet but weighted. "A heart divided is a heart destroyed." The smiling twin withdrew, her lips pressing into silence, her eyes dimming as though a cloud had passed before them. The cowboy stood between them, his chest burning with words he could not speak, his throat tight with the truth he dared not confess. That night, sleep would not claim him. He sat by the dying fire, its embers glowing red as blood, and stared into the flames. The twins were asleep in the next room, their breathing soft, steady, in rhythm. Yet he felt the storm inside him rising higher, tearing at the walls he had built. He wanted to choose, to end the torment, but every path he imagined left one face in shadow, one voice silenced. And he knew he could not bear to lose either. The days that followed pressed him deeper into the riddle. The ranch grew harsher under drought, and the cattle cried for water. He rode farther, searching for streams, digging deeper into dry earth, his body weary but his will unbroken. Through it all, the twins stood with him, their strength binding his when his own faltered. Yet the tension grew, a silent battle unspoken but felt in every glance, every touch, every pause in conversation. The ranch no longer echoed with solitude, it echoed with the weight of unchosen love. One night, under a sky blazing with stars, the quiet twin sat across from him, her eyes reflecting the fire's light. She spoke without pretense, her voice low but steady. "You think you must choose between us," she said. He froze, his chest tight, his breath shallow. She leaned closer, her gaze never leaving his. "But what if the choice is not yours to make?" Her words sank into him like stone into water, sending ripples he could not silence. He wanted to ask what she meant, but the look in her eyes silenced him. She rose, leaving him with the fire and the echo of her words. The cowboy felt himself unraveling. The land demanded strength, the ranch demanded labor, but his heart demanded a truth he could not find. Each twin carried a piece of him, each shadowed the other, and he knew that no matter which path he chose, the other path would haunt him forever. Yet he also knew that fate had not sent him two women by mistake. Destiny was not careless. The wagon had carried not one promise but two, and the meaning of that was still hidden from him. The prairie stretched wide, endless, merciless, but it was nothing compared to the wilderness inside his chest. And as he stood beneath the stars, the earth silent around him, he realized his story had only just begun. The days bled into one another, the sun rising and setting like a relentless wheel, but inside the cowboy the storm never quieted. He worked the land with blistered hands and aching muscles, yet no labor could strip away the weight that pressed against his chest. The drought tightened its grip, and the prairie grew harsher, but still the twins walked with him, two shadows cast by the same sun, their presence as inseparable as breath from body. One morning, when the sky hung heavy with a promise of rain that never came, the cowboy led the wagon toward town. Supplies were low, and hunger was pressing at the edges of their small home. The smiling twin sat beside him, her voice carrying soft stories of her childhood, each word a thread weaving warmth into the brittle air. He found himself listening not only to her words but to the music in her laughter, the way it made even the weary horses lift their heads. Behind them, the quiet twin sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her thoughts unreadable. In town, whispers followed them like shadows. Strangers stared at the cowboy walking between two identical women, their eyes curious, suspicious, even envious. The blacksmith leaned against his forge, smirking as they passed. "That's a storm you've brought home, cowboy," he muttered under his breath. The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they carried the echo of what the cowboy already feared, that his life was no longer his own, but a tale spun by fate for others to judge. That night, back at the ranch, the tension finally cracked. The smiling twin had been humming softly while mending a shirt, her needle flashing in lamplight, her voice light as air. The quiet twin watched from across the room, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, she spoke, her voice low but cutting through the silence like a blade. "Do you think this is a game?" The needle stilled in the other's hands, her smile fading. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone uncertain. The quiet twin's gaze shifted to the cowboy, hard, unyielding. "Every day he is torn apart. Every night he lies awake because we are both here. Do you not see it?" The cowboy's breath caught, his heart pounding as though it had been struck. The smiling twin lowered her eyes, her hands trembling. "I see it," she whispered. "But I cannot leave him. And I will not leave you." The room held its breath. The fire crackled, the wind pressed against the walls, and the cowboy felt his soul split open. He wanted to speak, to demand clarity, to cry out that he was only one man and could not bear the weight of two fates entwined, but his voice failed him. The quiet twin turned back to him, her eyes burning. "You think you can choose between us. But you can't. We are not meant to be separated. If you take one, you take both. That is the truth you keep running from." Her words struck him like lightning. He staggered beneath the force of them, his hands clenching as though grasping for something solid. The smiling twin rose, her face pale, her voice breaking. "But love does not divide. It is meant to be whole. How can he give us both what belongs to only one?" The quiet twin stepped closer, her eyes glistening with a fire that came from years of battles unseen. "Love has already bound us together. Do you not see? He is not choosing between us. He is being asked to choose us both. Fate did not bring two wagons, two paths, it brought one. One man, one life, and two of us bound as one." The cowboy felt the room spinning. His chest ached, his breath shallow, his thoughts a tangle of fear and longing. To take both. To bind himself to two women, identical yet different, light and shadow in one flame. It defied the laws he had been raised with, the codes whispered by town and church. The order of the world he thought he knew. And yet, it was truth. He felt it in his bones, deeper than words. He had tried to separate them in his heart, but the truth was they were inseparable. Each carried what the other lacked, and together they formed the whole he had been searching for without knowing. Days passed, and though no words were spoken of that night, the truth hung between them like an unlit lantern, heavy and waiting. The ranch demanded everything, the drought worsening, the cattle thin, the earth cracking deeper. He worked harder than ever, his muscles raw, his strength tested, but now he felt the twins beside him in a new way. When one laughed, the other watched. When one rested, the other labored. They were no longer two choices. They were a single force surrounding him, pulling him into a bond he could no longer deny. One evening, rain finally broke. The sky tore open, the heavens releasing months of silence in a torrent that drenched the earth. The cowboy stood in the field, the water pounding against his hat, soaking his shirt until it clung to his skin. He laughed, a raw sound torn from his chest. As the soil drank deeply, the cattle lifted their heads, and life surged back into the land. The twins ran into the storm, skirts heavy with rain, hair plastered to their faces, their laughter rising like music. For a moment, under the downpour, he saw them as one, two bodies, one soul, dancing in the storm that had saved them. And in that moment, he knew. The choice was never his to make. Fate had not brought him one bride, but two. Not to torment him, not to break him, but to forge a new kind of love, one that defied judgment, one that belonged only to them. That night, the fire burned low as he stood before them. His voice was rough, his words torn from the deepest part of him. I can't separate you. I can't tear one from the other. I was waiting for one bride, but fate brought me two. And if you'll have me, both of you, I will give all that I am, not divided, but whole. Silence wrapped the room, heavy as the rain outside. The smiling twin's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling as though she had been waiting her whole life for those words. The quiet twin's gaze softened, her steel melting into something fierce and tender. They stepped forward together, their hands reaching for his. And when his calloused palms closed around theirs, he felt the storm inside him finally break. From that day, the ranch became more than land and cattle. It became a home forged by three souls bound by a love that defied reason, a love that town whispers could not touch. The cowboy no longer walked alone, nor did he carry the weight of choice. The twins, once shadows of each other, became his light and his fire, and together they wrote a story that the land itself would never forget. The prairie winds carried whispers of scandal, of judgment, of disbelief. But the cowboy never listened. He had chosen not one, but both, and in doing so, had found what he had waited for all along. Not a single bride, but a love vast enough to hold two souls, a love wild enough to belong only to him. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now. Watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in the way you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.